The thick, fragrant oil was still dripping from a young shepherd's forehead when the aged prophet Samuel turned his back and walked away. The scent of myrrh, cinnamon, and olive oil hung heavy in the warm Judean air, a lingering physical proof of a divine collision. The heavy silence of 7 older, taller, stronger brothers filled the room, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock, jealousy, and confusion. And then, the moment ended. Samuel left, leaving a newly anointed king to go right back out into the dry, dusty fields to shovel sheep manure. We absolutely love the triumphant imagery of David's anointing. We celebrate the crown. We sing songs about the ultimate victory. But we completely ignore the 15 agonizing years of damp caves, bitter betrayal, and terrifying assassination attempts that followed that exact moment. We skip over the dirt and the blood to get to the throne. If you are staring at a promise from God that seems completely frozen in time, this is for you. Maybe you are sitting in a quiet, dimly lit room right now, holding a Bible in one hand and a broken reality in the other. Perhaps you're staring at a locked door you were absolutely certain God was going to open. You might be feeling the crushing weight of a silent heaven, listening to the deafening tick of the clock, wondering if you somehow misheard the voice of the Almighty. You feel the oil of His promise on your life, but all you can see around you is dirt. Most believers think that a promise from God is a fast pass to the finish line. We treat divine anointing like a magic wand. We act as if God speaks a word over your life and suddenly all the doors fly open. The Red Seas part. The skies clear, and your enemies just politely step aside to let you walk into your destiny. It is a comfortable, modern misunderstanding, a product of a culture that demands instant gratification, overnight shipping, and on-demand miracles. And it is a misunderstanding that leaves millions of Christians deeply, painfully confused when they hit a solid brick wall. What happens when the promotion doesn't come? What happens when you are sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit doctor's office and the healing is delayed? What happens when the spouse doesn't arrive and the house remains painfully quiet year after year? When the wait stretches on, we immediately assume we did something wrong. You trace your steps backward in your mind, desperately searching for the hidden sin, the misstep, or the lack of faith that derailed the train. Or worse, you arrive at the devastating conclusion that God wasn't actually speaking to you in the first place. You begin to believe that the anointing was a cruel illusion, but that is reading the nature of God entirely wrong. We look at a delay and see a denial. God looks at a delay and sees a development phase. Think about the patriarch Joseph. Long before David, there was a teenager who received a vivid, undeniable promise from God in the form of a dream. He saw sheaves of wheat bowing down. He saw the sun, moon, and stars paying homage. But the immediate fulfillment of that promise was not a throne in Egypt. The immediate fulfillment was the violent, tearing sound of his colorful coat being ripped from his shoulders by his own brothers. The next stop was the suffocating darkness of a dry, rough-hewn cistern in the wilderness. Can you imagine the gritty dust in Joseph's mouth? Can you smell the sweat and spices of the Midianite caravan that bought him as a piece of property? Can you feel the cold, unyielding iron of the chains in Potiphar's dungeon? For 13 years, Joseph lived in the agonizing gap between the promise and the palace. 13 years of being falsely accused, forgotten, and left to rot in the dark. If God's promises meant instant comfort, Joseph's story makes zero sense. But in the damp darkness of that Egyptian prison, God was not punishing Joseph. He was preparing him. He was forging the character required to carry the heavy weight of a nation's survival. God had to strip the arrogance of the favored son before he could clothe him in the authority of a prime minister. Now, think back to David. He was anointed as a teenager, but he didn't sit on the throne of Judah until he was 30. 15 years of running for his life. If you want to understand the gap between the promise and the fulfillment, you have to look closely at those 15 years. David didn't go from the pasture to the palace. He went from the pasture to the terrifying, adrenaline-fueled reality of dodging a king's wrath. Imagine the sudden, violent thwack of a heavy, bronze-tipped spear embedding itself into the plaster wall just inches from David's head. Imagine the frantic, breathless escape out of a window in the dead of night, leaving his wife and his home behind as assassins surrounded his house. David was driven into the wilderness, forced to hide in the cave of Adullam. Have you ever considered the reality of that cave? It wasn't a romantic retreat. It was a dark, cold, limestone cavern that smelled of smoke and unwashed bodies. And who did God send to keep the future king company? Not the elite, not the wealthy. 1 Samuel 22 says that everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. Imagine the constant, grating sound of 400 bitter, angry men echoing off the walls of a dark cave. This was David's royal court. At one point, the anointed king of Israel was so desperate and terrified of his enemies that he fled to the Philistine city of Gath and had to feign insanity just to survive. Picture the anointed one of God, scratching frantically at the wooden doors of the city gate, letting thick spit run down his beard into the dirt. Where was the promise then? Where was the crown? Where was the glory? Perhaps you are standing in your own version of Gath right now, feeling humiliated, stripped of your dignity, and wondering how your life ended up here. Maybe you are hiding in your own cave of Adullam. You can feel the damp, suffocating walls of isolation closing in on you. You hear the echoes of your own doubts bouncing off the stone, amplified by the voices of the distressed and discontented people around you. You are looking at the heavy darkness, wondering how God could possibly build a kingdom out of this mess. But you must understand this profound truth. The waiting room of God is not a waiting room at all. It is a workshop. It is a crucible. God is far more interested in the person you're becoming while you wait than the destination you are rushing toward. The boy who killed Goliath with a single stone was brave, but he was not yet ready to rule a fractured, complex nation. The raw material was there, but it had to be refined in the fire of adversity. God had to burn away the impatience. He had to chisel away the self-reliance. He had to teach David how to lead broken people in a cave before he would ever let him lead a nation from a throne. God uses the wilderness to kill the pride that would otherwise destroy you when you finally step into power. Consider Moses standing on the burning sands of Midian. He had been a prince of Egypt, clothed in fine linen, walking on polished marble floors. But when he tried to step into his calling prematurely, in his own strength, it ended in murder and exile. For 40 years, Moses wandered in the brutal, blinding glare of the desert sun. Can you feel the rough, calloused wood of the shepherd's staff in his hands? Can you hear the endless, monotonous bleating of Jethro's sheep? For 4 decades, Moses stared at the dusty horizon, a forgotten man in a forgotten wasteland. Maybe you feel exactly like Moses on the backside of the desert. The days blur together. The mundane routine of your life threatens to crush your spirit. You sweep the same floors. You drive the same commute. You fight the same invisible battles. And you wonder if God has simply forgotten your address. You feel the heat of the wilderness beating down on your back, and you assume the promise has expired. But it took 40 years of silence for God to strip the Egypt out of Moses so that Moses could lead Israel out of Egypt. The desert wasn't a denial of Moses' calling, it was the intense, required prerequisite for it. The burning bush did not appear until Moses had been thoroughly emptied of his own strength. The same is true for you. The delay you are experiencing right now is not a sign of God's rejection. It is the clearest evidence of His preparation. If God hands you a blessing before you have the character to carry it, that blessing will crush you. If He gives you the platform before you have the humility to stand on it, you will fall. If He opens the door before you are spiritually mature enough to walk through it, you will compromise the very assignment He created you for. The caves, the pits, and the deserts are not accidents. They are the anvils upon which the Almighty shapes His most trusted instruments. So, if you are staring at a promise that seems frozen, do not throw away your confidence. Do not misinterpret the silence of God as the absence of God. The oil that Samuel poured over David's head did not evaporate in the heat of the wilderness. It did not wash off when David was sweating in the cave. It did not lose its power when Saul hurled his spears. The anointing remained active, working deep beneath the surface, transforming a ruddy shepherd boy into the man after God's own heart. The promise God has spoken over your life has not expired. The dream He planted in your spirit is not dead. It is gestating in the dark. Do not resent the season of shoveling sheep manure. Do not curse the darkness of the cave. Embrace the development phase. Let the isolation do its work. Let the delay forge an unshakable endurance within your spirit. Keep showing up in the unseen, unglamorous, uncelebrated moments of your life. Keep being faithful with the few sheep in the wilderness. Keep trusting the one who holds the timeline. The crown is coming. The promise will be fulfilled. But first, the king must be forged.